Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an unprecedented geopolitical vulnerability that is staring down the global defense supply chain. And listen, this isn't some distant theoretical problem. It is operating on a very real, very fast-ticking clock. We are going to break down a highly complex, trillion-dollar standoff centered on a massive, looming deadline, the November 2026 cliff regarding global rare earth export controls. We'll look at exactly what this means for the future of global military supremacy and, frankly, everyday macroeconomic stability. To really understand this, we've broken our journey today into 5 key areas. We'll cover the November 2026 cliff, what we call the cinnamon of defense, how the supply chain is being weaponized, the midstream chemistry choke point, and finally, the desperate race for independence. Let's jump right in. All right, Section 1, the November 2026 cliff. The countdown begins. So let's start with the looming deadline that makes this whole situation an absolute ticking time bomb for the U.S. military-industrial complex. If you look at this timeline, it perfectly illustrates the trap we're in. Back in April 2025, active curbs on heavy rare earth elements were implemented. Then, in October 2025, a massive wave of dual-use embargoes was announced by Beijing, but they were temporarily suspended. Now, here's the catch. That suspension is merely a conditional pause. It's essentially a diplomatic truce masking a highly sophisticated regulatory architecture. If a permanent resolution isn't hammered out, all those regulations forcefully snap right back into effect in November 2026. And if that snapback actually happens, the global consequences are absolutely staggering. As the International Energy Agency points out right here, a full reimplementation of these controls places about $6.5 trillion in annual economic activity outside of China at acute risk. To put that into perspective, we are not talking about some minor supply delays or tiny logistical hiccups. We are talking about an existential macroeconomic threat to the entire global order. Moving on to Section 2, the cinnamon of defense. Why rare earths matter. You know, the word rare and rare earths is actually kind of a historical misnomer. They aren't perfectly scarce in the Earth's crust, but they are incredibly, painstakingly difficult to extract and separate. A great way to think about it is baking. Base metals, like iron, aluminum, and copper, are your flour, eggs, and milk. You need massive volumes of them to build anything. But rare earths? They're the cinnamon and nutmeg. You only use minuscule amounts, but they are the fundamental active ingredients. Without them, the whole recipe just doesn't work. They are what makes advanced technology possible. And the crazy thing is, our most advanced defense platforms possess massive volumetric dependencies on these exact spices. Take an F-35 Lightning I, for example. It requires over 920 pounds of rare earths just for things like radar, targeting optics, and turbine coatings. A Virginia-class submarine? You're looking at over 9,200 pounds. That is literally 4.5 tons of rare earths just for sonar arrays and electric propulsion. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer needs over 5,200 pounds for its Aegis radar and missile guidance. So the takeaway here is you simply cannot build or maintain the modern theater of war without immense, uninterrupted quantities of these materials. Now, to actually make those defense platforms function, you need highly specialized magnets. Enter NdFb, or neodymium iron boron. This is the strongest commercially available permanent magnet on the planet, possessing over 10 times the magnetic energy of traditional ferrite magnets. If you want to build autonomous drone technology or smart munitions, this specific magnet is an absolute requirement because it allows for extreme miniaturization. And to prevent it from demagnetizing at high speeds, it has to be enhanced with heavy rare earths like dysprosium and terbium. But that's not the only magnet we need. We also heavily rely on SAMCO, or samarium cobalt. While the neodymium magnet gives you raw power and miniaturization, this one provides extreme environmental resilience. It literally retains its magnetic strength in conditions where regular magnets would melt or fail completely. That extreme high-temperature resilience is exactly why samarium cobalt is the mandated standard for high-heat environments like advanced jet engines and the Patriot missile air defense system. If a military is tracking a high-speed missile threat, they are absolutely relying on this specific chemistry. Let's look at Section 3, weaponizing the supply chain, the extraterritorial blockade. I want you to focus on this tiny number, 0.1%. 0.1. While it looks entirely insignificant, this number represents a massive extraterritorial legal weapon known as the de minimis rule, and it is fundamentally altering global manufacturing jurisdictions as we know them.
So how does this actually play out on the legal battlefield? Well, this rule triggers Chinese export licensing requirements if just 0.1% of a product's value consists of Chinese origin rare earths. It's essentially functioning as a mirror to the U.S. foreign direct product rule. But it goes even further. It includes a 50% affiliates rule. This creates a literal corporate blockade against the global subsidiaries of 16 recently sanctioned U.S. entities. It is specifically designed to fracture multinational assembly lines. Imagine a subcontractor in Europe relying on trace amounts of Chinese rare earths for a tiny piece of an F-35. Under this rule, the entire assembly line stalls. It forces these secondary global suppliers to make a very hard choice. You can either utilize Chinese raw materials or you can sell to the U.S. defense apparatus, but you absolutely cannot do both.
Which brings us to Section 4, the midstream chemistry choke point, the mining myth.
There's this incredibly persistent expectation out there that the West can simply solve this crisis by digging more ore out of the ground. Let's bust that myth right now. The true bottleneck is not geologic scarcity. We have the rocks. The problem is the deeply complex chemical engineering required to separate those mixed, messy rare earth oxides into highly pure individual elements. The harsh reality is that allied nations have plenty of raw ore, but they severely lack the midstream solvent extraction capabilities to actually do anything useful with it. Because turning rocks into magnets is a literal engineering nightmare. Step 1, sure, you extract the mixed ore. Step 2, you apply high-temperature reactions in massive steel apparatuses. But step 3 is the massive hurdle. We're dealing with 15 lanthanide elements that are remarkably similar in atomic size and chemical behavior. Separating them isn't like filtering water. It requires hundreds of highly precise, sequential liquid-liquid solvent extraction stages. And this is exactly where the targeted embargo hits the hardest. Under the suspended announcements that are threatening to snap back in 2026, announcement number 56 explicitly bans the export of the centrifugal extraction equipment needed for this process, as well as crucial chemical extractants, like P507. Then, announcement number 62 reinforces this with a comprehensive intellectual property embargo and a strict substantial assistance ban, meaning Chinese experts cannot help Western firms. By embargoing the specific equipment, the chemicals, and the human expertise, this ensures that Western nations physically cannot separate the ore they mine unless they somehow invent completely new, non-infringing chemical processes entirely from scratch.
That leads us to our final area, Section 5, the race for independence. Operation Warp Speed. With that November 2026 clock ticking loudly, the U.S. and its allies have launched massive public-private partnerships to try and bypass this blockade. Domestically, the Department of Defense is pouring backing into MP materials out in California. And they are making progress. They've aggressively ramped up production of neodymium and praseodymium from roughly 1,300 metric tons in 2024 to nearly 2,600 in 2025. But look closely at that chart. Notice that massive capacity jump to 10,000 metric tons? Their highly ambitious expansion facility won't be fully ready until 2028. That creates a highly dangerous 2-year operational gap right after the 2026 cliff expires. Meanwhile, to circumvent that massive intellectual property embargo on chemical processing we just talked about, entirely new processes are being urgently scaled. For example, Ucore Rare Metals is utilizing DoD funding down in Louisiana to commercialize a proprietary technology called Rapid SX. The goal here is to completely bypass the traditional embargoed solvent extractors and process these oxides at a significantly faster rate without infringing on restricted IP. But remember, separating the elements is only the middle step. The U.S. lacks a deep domestic bench for the very final stage, actual magnet manufacturing. So the strategy heavily leans on a transnational alliance, primarily with Japanese high-tech magnet manufacturers. Just look at the immense capacity held by firms like Proterial, Shinetsu Chemical, and TDK. They hold the critical engineering capability to translate those raw, separated elements into the highly miniaturized, perfectly calibrated components the defense sector actually requires. So all of these pieces have to fit perfectly together in a massive transnational relay race to bypass the choke point. Step 1, ore is extracted in places like Western Australia. Step 2, it gets refined at Lynas facilities over in Malaysia and Texas. Step 3, it is manufactured into high-performance permanent magnets in Japan. And finally, Step 4, those magnets are integrated into U.S. and allied defense platforms. It's a landmarked, multi-country supply agreement attempting to create an economically viable, closed-loop supply chain that is 100% independent of Chinese infrastructure. So, let's bring it all home. Why does this matter to us beyond just military procurement? Well, if this alternative supply chain fails to scale up in time, the economic fallout is going to be highly contagious. The Transatlantic Trade Alliance risks fracturing under the massive weight of compliance. European tech sectors face decoupling from U.S. markets because of those strict 0.1% extraterritorial rules, which seriously threatens the EU's own green energy transition. But perhaps most critically, on a macroeconomic scale, it directly challenges the bedrock of U.S. dollar dominance. Financial analysts are warning that by physically degrading the force projection capabilities of the U.S. military, you are fundamentally undermining the perceived security that backs the dollar itself. If that security fractures, it impacts everything from global trade all the way down to the purchasing power in your own wallet. Which leaves us staring at a pretty monumental geopolitical question. As that expiration date rapidly approaches, we have to ask ourselves, will this unprecedented technological acceleration and global coordination actually be enough to defuse the time bomb? Can this Allied Operation Warp Speed outpace the ticking clock? Or will the November 2026 cliff fundamentally alter global military supremacy forever? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep a very close eye on this approaching deadline.